this frail construction of quick nerves and bones, cannot sustain the shock of elements. This temporary blend of blood and dust was put together only to dissolve. What is the verdict of the vastest mind? Silence.
The spectatorial experience of emotion in dance performance is such that it is not apt to be translated into words. It is, in this sense, ineffable. Now, we might disagree that this is a highly emotional solo by Crystal Paitas, choreographer and dancer Germaine Spivey. For now, however, I want to focus on the idea that the most common explanations of emotion in dance, in art really, fail to account for the complexity of the emotion experienced from works of dance. I argue that, unlike in explanations such as expression theory, disinterest, or kinesthetic empathy, we need to come back to actually look at the work itself so that we can look at the experience as a whole. The real issue, though, is that dance usually deals with people feeling that they didn't understand it. And what do we mean exactly by this? I didn't get it. Why is there this need to understand dance? This assumption of the obligation of understanding dance, of dance as a fundamentally narrative or thematic art form, this actually damages dance because we cannot understand it in its own terms. My idea then is to understand dance as an active embodied cognition, as a form of cognition in itself, without the need to refer to anything outside of the dance itself. For this, we need to understand dance as an active, as includes the experience of the spectator, and also as embodied, and also including the experiences of the dancer, the choreographer, and all the creative team. However, what I argue is that it is the perceptual properties that hold the emotional power of dance. So things like atmosphere, emotion, symbolism, texts, they are all part of these perceptual elements. And through an active embodied cognition, we can explain how these perceptual elements hold the emotional power of dance. My main question is then, what makes dance works emotionally powerful? And more specifically, what in the dance works makes them emotionally expressive? The analysis of the case studies then takes the form of an approach consisting of analysis of movement qualities, choreomusical structures, and spatial rhythm. Dance scholar Einaf Katan argues that in dance there is an immanent interrelatedness of bodily movements with their semblance. Tension in the muscles expresses tension in the soul. Although this quote seems intuitive enough to achieve general agreement, my argument is that the relationship between the bodily movement and its meaning is significantly more complex than that. Ballet movements often imply muscle tension, even when expressive of the most gentle emotions. Similarly, there is certain isometric tone needed to execute a suspension in contemporary dance, but the meaning of this movement is not often associated with a tension in the soul. To delineate my understanding of movement qualities, I make use of effort-shape theory as part of Laban's system of movement analysis, as well as its developments in the work of his disciples, mainly Valerie Preston Dunlop. Qualities and their characterizations emerge from combinations of weight, space, and time, to which I add flow as a further distinction. Although I use the original terms for effort actions and add the factor of flow, I also recognize that these are in themselves widely disputed. I make use of them in this project for clarity and speed of categorization, but I also acknowledge their problems through my analysis as necessary. In the solo I studied in this presentation, movements are performed in thrusting or punching efforts at points. For example, when landing from a jump with a particularly heavy accent, marking the final position of movement phrases which have been performed in a gliding effort throughout, or with single body parts making a thrusting or punching movement. Reviewers speak of buckling, rippling phrases or fluid explosive style phrases, or they point out how the cast moves with astonishing ease, the smooth flow of a dancer's movement abruptly freezing in a wary pose, or with his energy briefly channeled into a peripheral gesture. So let's see an example. In this long pressing turn that finishes in a fouette and elongation of both legs and arm, properties come together and then break apart, and an emotional effect seems to emerge from this evolving interaction. The turn and fouette are gliding but quite slow, almost pressing. The elongation is pressing, with very bound flow, producing the feeling that the dancer is suspended in that position. This moment contradicts the most organic way to perform the particular movement, the turn and fouette. Organic here refers to movements in which qualities seem to be used because of the needs of the particular sequence, or efforts that seem more appropriate to the sequence in particular cases. Examples of these more appropriate efforts in relation to particular movements are the use of dabbing or thrusting efforts to reach a position, or pressing to finish a sequence. The use of a punching effort in a fall is also a case of this. Equally, some steps seem to be more successfully performed with a particular quality. Examples of these are high jumps, which seem to need thrust, or turns, which seem to need gliding. This also adds power to these particular movements when they are performed in a more unexpected quality, as is the case with this turn performed in pressing effort, when turns are most commonly performed in gliding effort because of their nature, making this one of the most impressive moments of this section of the solo, both technically and emotionally. In this solo, it is also possible to perceive mixes of qualities due to changes of muscle tone, such as the one between pressing and gliding qualities. When the muscle tone is softer, the quality appears as gliding, whereas a stronger muscle tone, a resistance in weight, will render it pressing. The use of muscle tone is a key factor both in the differentiation between qualities and, judging by the analysis in this research project, an important variable in the spectator's experience of emotional import too. In pursuing the analysis of spatial rhythm, this project unites concepts and ideas from the visual arts, mainly the work of Rudolf Arnheim, with concepts and ideas from movement analysis, mainly from Rudolf Laban and his disciples. You can see here what elements have been chosen from each of these models in order to build the model that I present. So the particular model I use refers to lines of tension, which are the use of direction and the dancer's position, and also give the sense of spatial projection. And these lines do not need to be anatomically, do not need to follow the form of the body, but they can also be virtual lines of tension created by the shape of the body. The second element would be the areas of attention, which are where the viewer's eye is directed within a still frame and are often linked to things such as light, or often have to do with hands or face because we tend to look at them. The third element would be the direction of pull, which is an outward projection in the image when a sense of push towards a particular direction or movement towards a particular direction is evident. And finally, the direction of the dancer's gaze, or where the dancer is looking, what I name the focal point, is also one of the key elements in this model of analysis. So now for an example of spatial rhythm. Empty space is important to this example, as can be seen both in the space created by the position of the hands and by how the leg supports this energized space, specifically with the turning in and cycling of the right foot, which can be seen in the image. What makes this still frame particularly interesting, however, is that this internal space of energy is contrasted with the fact that the position is actually large and open. The overall image given is actually one of volume and reaching out in the space. It is an interesting contrast that reflects the contradictory feeling that the solo presents throughout. The tension between internal space and volume in the position intensifies the energy of the dancer by concentrating it in space. The sense of power reaches out, exudes from the body, but does not disperse out on stage. One of the most interesting perceptions within the solo is a mixed quality verging towards a dubbing effort, which does not produce the seemingly corresponding sense of outward spatial projection of this movement quality. Perhaps there is room here to argue a different sense of projection within the spatial rhythm, in which there is no need for the outward sense of spatial continuity usually associated with projection, or the contained energy of the empty space. The position of the body does not create an energy that is held within constraints of the body, but one that surrounds and releases from the body. This different sense of projection can be associated with the impression of power. There seems to be a difference in my emotional experience of cases of projection and of power. Spatial projection, through its outward reaching and linear visuals, tends to give a lighter, uplifting sensation, evoking a sense of excitement and positive feelings. Power, more concentrated in space and hence giving more impression of intensity, is more animalistic, visceral, grounded. The stops, the thrusting and punching efforts, together with this kind of dubbing quality, are also highlighted by reviewers. And they seem to be particularly relevant to the spectator's experience in terms of emotional import. As an example, Catherine Thomas describes how the dancers slash and freeze in pristine angles, contort, tangle, and ricochet, which for her seems to give the work a sense of a world undergoing destruction. I will now move directly into a sound-movement relationship analysis, for which I use Stephanie Jordan's model, and into an analysis of a scene that is an example of the integration of all properties and how they affect the emotional import.
But thinking atoms, whose far-seeing eyes, guided by thought, have measured the faint stars, our being.
This sequence exemplifies the experience of emotion as emergent from relationships between properties. Although the general movement quality of the sequence is gliding, there are exceptions in certain movements, such as the lowering to the floor performed in a pressing effort, the punch with the elbow, the sharp impulse to come off the floor with a half turn, and the final gesture hand movements, which are closer to a very bound pressing quality. The words coincide with the first jump, then with the turn, then thought coincides with the punch of the elbow. The dancer comes up and then stops with half measured. To the faint starts, 3 movements are performed. 1 just before the voice starts, so that the end of the gesture coincides with the beginning of the voice. 1 with the marked T sound at the end of the word faint. 1 to the word stars. Interestingly, faster movements seem to occur in the silences. The turning up, the acceleration at the end of the attitude turn, and the impulse to come up. The final gesture of the hands also falls after the sentence has finished. This use of movement, silence, and words create a shared rhythm between movement qualities and sound. This is perhaps one of the key observations of the analysis of sound and movement together in this case study. They not only share a pulse throughout, even when they seem to oppose each other, they actually create a shared rhythm between them. It is not only the way the movement is matched to the words, but also the sense of rhythm that continues in the moments of silence, that create this sense of shared rhythm between both properties, constituting the rhythm of the work. This idea emerges also from the application of Jordan's concept of blur synchronization between movement and music. I believe this shared rhythm to be a key to my experience of emotion in the performance. After all, rhythm has already been linked to expressiveness, both in Laban and in other authors. Dissociation of body parts is very present in this solo, with instances of body parts performing movements in pressing, gliding, or punching efforts, while the rest of the body performs in a different quality. This is very common in the case of head and arms performing movements in a punching effort, and a very important aspect of my experience of emotion in the performance, likely to do with a more pedestrian gestural meaning that these movements and efforts relate to. The combination of qualities present in this solo is perhaps best described by critic Claudia Larocco when she states that movement impulses might begin at any point in the body, sending tides of undulating but tightly controlled energy throughout the dancer's honed muscular forms. In terms of the stage space, the dancer descends downstage in a strong diagonal, to then revert back halfway in the same direction, and finally face the audience for the walk and gestures moving downstage. A sense of hesitation and struggle seems to be transmitted by the work here, in a sense of deliberately uncertain movements. Another even more literal sense of contradiction is perceived in the spatial rhythm for the frame in this image. Although it is clear that the dancer is descending towards the floor, the pull perceived is an upward direction, which can be related to the physical pull that the dancer needs to perform at this point to be able to lower himself slowly on one shin without hurting himself. The fact that the head repeatedly moves in a direction different from the line of movement, which is also observed in the spatial rhythm analysis, also gives a sense of physical struggle that adds to the emotional charge of the work. Projection, changes of direction, and change of pull are likely to be the reason the work is perceived as transmitting a sense of instability. Though the choreography is finely wrought, it also looks as if it might fly apart at any moment, unraveling the equilibrium. Contrary to this, lines of tension and other elements of space can create very stable, almost geometric rhythms, producing harmony and balance, as in this image. Balance and indeed harmony can be found in more dynamic spatial rhythms, when opposing forces neutralize one another. This corresponds to Arnheim's definition of balance in composition. Finally, there are some aspects of the movement in this section that, although not directly related to qualities, seem to contribute to the emotional import of the work in my experience. One of these is the moment when Spivey walks, his fingers rapidly up through his torso onto his face. This is a delicate moment that seems to be full of emotional content, once again perhaps due to associations to everyday gestural movements, which hold meaning for a Western audience, an indication of caresses, tickling, or simply delicate sensibility. A sense of contrast between balance and instability is perceived through the hesitant use of the full space, and the opposition between what is physical, the dancer going to the floor, and what is perceptual, the pull-up perceived through that moment. This scene moves from an emotional import of control and power to that of vulnerability. It does this through a shared rhythm created between the movement qualities, gliding interspersed with thrusting movements, bodily dissociation, and the words, including different structural relationships of movement and voice or silence. Although I do not have time to enter into these relationships in detail, I share now some examples of them.
This temporary blend of blood and dust. But in the shock of elements, cannot sustain the shock of elements. Only to dissolve. Only to dissolve. Only to dissolve. Silence. Silence.
Through this correlation between words, meaning, and movement, some questions about the integration of emotionally important narrative arise. Although the second act of Dark Matters does not have a clear sense of narrative, our perception of it is informed by the first act, which does have a clear storyline. Pite herself expects this to happen. Here, I argue, lies the key to Pite's work. In this solo, as well as in her style in general, her sense of narrative is intensely physicalized, making it impossible to separate it from the other properties of the work. This is not so evident in her more theatrical approaches, such as in the first act of Dark Matters, but it is clear in the solo analyzed here. The poem is also part of this integration. Indeed, as Dickinson argues, when considered as but one element within the total sensory environment of the performance, rather than as that which exists externally and a priori to make sense of this environment, then text starts to take on another texture. It begins to matter not just indexically or symbolically, but also acoustically, visually, somatically. The same argument can easily be applied to the potentially contentious issue of the dancer's facial expression and gestural movement as the carriers of narrative. Although the facial expression and gestures which seem to underline this sense of meaning may affect our view of the work, it is not plausible to suggest that they alone do the expressive work. Facial expressions and gestures are relevant in that they are also perceptual features of the work. Catherine Thomas talks about the last duet of Dark Matters as a shifting marvel of mime and dance. This description could easily apply to the solo. It is both things at work, inseparable as they are, which gives the emotional impact to Pite's choreography. Reviewers talk about themes beautifully embodied in this potent and affecting show. Josling also describes it as a haunting portrait of the unknown presented through breathtaking movement. Jennings is clearer even in his line of argument. You don't have to get the references to read Pite's work. Her intentions are conveyed with strange, fierce intensity through the wordless language of the body. Her work's emotional power, then, lies in the perceptual properties of the work, and it integrates facial expression and gestures as well as meaning conveyed through the poem and other information through the particular understanding of perception as enacted. In conclusion, the notions of enactive perception and embodied cognition are intimately related. In fact, they are phenomenologically and conceptually inseparable. They need each other to make sense. Understanding perception as enactive implies that perception is action, but also that cognitive structures emerge from the sensory-motor patterns that enable action to be perceptually guided. The perceiver, then, possesses a sensory-motor structure, which is the manner in which the perceiver is embodied. Insights from the analysis of this case study support this idea that reason itself, the cognitive, comes from the details of our embodiment, from our enacted perception. In my example, opposing forces in the body produce a disjointed feeling through movement qualities, spatial rhythm, sound, words, gestures, facial expressions. All the forces working within this dance create a physicality that varies between a sense of power and a sense of vulnerability, or produces contradiction by presenting both at the same time. This conflict between power and vulnerability, which are both perceptual and emotional, is paradigmatic as to how emotional import emerges in the experience of contemporary dance and how it can be best understood. The key concept for this emergence is indeed embodied cognition, as it allows me to posit not only that there is no need or use for a Cartesian divide, but that reason is not completely conscious, which can relate also to how spectators seem to be not fully aware of the structures underlying their experience of emotional import. Moreover, reason is also emotionally engaged, according to these theories, which establishes further the relationship between cognition, embodiment, and emotion. The amount of information, of processing, of work, that is, which is involved in watching a work of dance, the complexity of the experience, might explain this difficulty to bring it into focus right away. I characterize the spectator's experience of emotional import in dance as a bodily, thoughtful, ineffable, enactive, cognitive, perceptual process. It is focused on the properties of the work, but its workings depend on a series of agents: spectator, choreographer, dancer, and also the rest of the creative team. In my research, I explore how it might be possible to disentangle this complex experience by looking in detail at its underlying structures, but also by providing a conceptual framework through which to understand it. My experience of watching these works of dance is a process of enactive perception guided by my existing sensory-motor structures. These have been formed emerging from patterns of previous experiences with the world. Not only past experiences of watching dance, but training, choreographic experiences, and more generally life experience. These form my embodied concepts which guide my experience of emotional import in these works. These frameworks of understanding, however, and here resides the real complexity of the experience, do not allow me to have a sense of clear definition in the explanation of the experience of emotion. I can illustrate it, demonstrate it, and characterize examples of it, but I cannot pin it down with any form of finality. I can explain the experience through enactive perception and embodied cognition, but I cannot ground it through these processes. Francisco Varela and colleagues talk about this sense of groundlessness. The job of the analyst, both in dance and philosophy, would then be to identify and illustrate forms of experience, but always accepting the impossibility to ever really finalize the task.